There's a story at the actual Congress, the Continental Congress, that after the July vote was made, one delegate said, "Well, we're all going to have to hang together." To which, of course, Benjamin Franklin responded, "That's true because we're going to most assuredly all hang separately," as a reference to what would take place if they were caught by British authorities and if the American rebellion wasn't successful. For it to be successful, for independence to become a reality, the Revolutionary War had to prove to be successful. So oftentimes historians of the American Revolution call the year 1777, the three sevens, the year of the hangman. And that year, the British have kind of a twofold strategy. They had been somewhat hesitant at putting down the rebellion in the first year. They had cornered Washington and the Continental Army with their backs to the water on Long Island and then at Manhattan, and had not gone in for the final destruction of the Continental Army. I think the British, throughout most of this conflict, think that it's going to be a question of capturing a lot of the major American cities and population centers, and that might bring the rebellion to an end. They realize too late that the one thing they have to do is destroy and obliterate the Continental Army and all of the forces that are scattered around fighting the British throughout this conflict. But they do begin, the British, 1777, with a fairly ambitious strategy. And so we'll go to the PowerPoint when we consider it. The one thing they like to do in 1777, as we make this map larger, is first take an army out of Quebec. Now, keep in mind that the British in 1776 have already captured New York. They occupy it for the entire rest of the American Revolution. But the other part of their effort is to take an army actually out of Quebec and march it down the area of Lake Champlain, and then hopefully take the army further down along the Hudson River. And that way, if they make their way to Albany and capture it, they'll be able to kind of isolate and cut off New England because the British mistakenly think that this is solely a rebellion of the New England colonies, or now we can call them states. So they get that part of the entire big strategy wrong as well. So the other part of their strategy is to capture the American capital. Of course, that exists in Philadelphia here on the Delaware River. This is the headquarters of the Continental Congress, the Congress that met after the battles of Lexington and Concord stays in session. They draft the Articles of Confederation, and effectively, they are the Congress. They are running the war effort for the remainder of this saga. So that is their two-pronged strategy in 1777, and they accomplish part of it. So we'll go back to the notes and we'll pull up this so we kind of get you an idea of where we're orienting ourselves. First, capture Philadelphia, and at the same time, so this is happening simultaneously in the fall of 1777, move an army down through New York. So we'll evaluate which of those, if any, were at all successful. We'll go back to the notes. If they capture Congress, of course, and the capital, that's going to bring an end to this conflict. So they think. So Washington isn't a fan of this, but he knows he has to go where the British Army is moving. So the army that moves up the Delaware River with their sights set on Philadelphia, he tries to keep them, the British Army, from capturing Philadelphia successfully. He fights two battles near Philadelphia in the fall of 1777, the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Germantown. The Continental Army, which had fought so poorly the year before in New York, which Washington was seen in one part literally using his sword to club retreating soldiers, saying, "Are these the men with which I'm supposed to, defend American liberties?" He was really frustrated, and the answer was yes. They did not make very good soldiers early on. In 1777, the army did fight better, but both of these battles proved unsuccessful, and the British were able to march into Philadelphia and capture it. And the Congress decided when the British army was near, they fled, and they fled into the hinterlands of Pennsylvania in order to continue to conduct the government of the American Revolution. So Washington's takeaway now. So there's been two full seasons of fighting, 1776, 1777. And his overall summary of the course of events is, first of all, we can't. The Continental Army cannot. As much as I'd like it to, as much as I would hope it would be a European-style fighting force, it is not. So we can't fight toe-to-toe with the British regulars. They're one of the finest infantry armies in the world. They are incredibly well trained. The Continental Army lacks discipline. A lot of the soldiers don't stay in for the long haul. They need more training, which they can't seem to get throughout a major part of the war. And the other part of the story, and the other part of the conclusion that Washington comes to, two of them. We can't fight toe to toe with the British Army. Secondly, and this is the most important part, he doesn't have to. So Washington decides that he's not going to any longer risk the destruction of the Continental Army. In the battles to try to keep the British out of Philadelphia, he had developed these really elaborate plans that didn't go well, largely because he didn't have the soldiers that could carry out these plans. So his takeaway after these 2 years of fighting is that what we will do, what the leadership of the Continental Army will do, is pick and choose where we fight. And we'll fight when the odds favor us, and we'll fight on our own terms. And Washington doesn't like to do this. He's a fighter uh, in his own way of thinking, but he also knows that if you risk the destruction of the Continental Army, you're going to end the revolution. Because in the course of the American Revolution, the public isn't always supportive of the war. They get tired of it. The Congress doesn't seem to be supporting the soldiers and the officers and being able to manage this conflict by which, it's independence is on the line and they're still not doing very well. So that's the takeaway from that. And the other conclusion we can draw is right there in the notes. For the revolution to survive, the army must survive. And he doesn't really fight all but a couple major battles from this point until the very end. He risks the army when he can, and when he knows that the chances of victory are clear to him. So that's the first part of the British strategy. It goes incredibly well. The other part, where we reference the map of New York and New England, does not go well at all for the English. In fact, it goes terribly wrong for them. What takes place is that this grand army that marches out of Canada down the Hudson River, and this is a separate American army led by other officers and generals. One of them, who accords himself very well here in the battles in upstate New York, is none other than the future famous traitor Benedict Arnold, who will later sell out American interest and join the British, one of the biggest turncoats of world, if not American history. But it is the couple of battles around what's called Saratoga in New York. The Saratoga battles in September and October of 1777 are seen as one of the turning points of the American Revolution. An entire British army surrenders. General Burgoyne's army surrenders there. They don't get close to Albany, and they are harassed the whole way by New England, New York militia, and then by an army that is led by General Gates. So these names aren't critical for you to know, but the battle certainly is. Because up to this point, the efforts of the Americans since the Second Continental Congress had been to try to get some foreign aid, which came from France, American uniforms, American French muskets, ammunition. Financial support comes in from France because the way they see it, if they can take England down a peg, that would be fantastic. And by supporting the American Rebellion, that's one way to do it. But lest we forget, and as we look at a slide about some of the efforts, it's often we give Benjamin Franklin a lot of credit for the events after the Saratoga battlefield. And what happens is that after this battle, it becomes clear, to the French that the infant United States might be successful. And so France decides they will join in a formal treaty with the United States. So the Battle of Saratoga, it's that bit of good news that can bring about this very desired treaty. And so the treaty says that the French will fight with the United States until England agrees to recognize American independence. We say that we will not make a separate peace with Great Britain. Of course, we go and do that on our own anyway. And then in the aftermath of kind of backstabbing the French, we say, can you also give us a loan? So it's a really bold strategy by the United States, by Franklin and the other negotiating team. And he goes over there, and you can see in this slide, he turns on all the charm. The United States representatives tell France that here are our conditions by which you will become our ally. And the French are like, wait a minute, aren't you kind of coming to us hat in hand, begging for aid? And we're like, yeah, but do A, B, C, and D, and we'll go along with it. So from the alliance, you're going to get more than just formal aid and recognition of the United States, but you will get now France as an ally, which means the French army will be moving to the United States, North American continent, which they do. They will send their navy over as well, which they also do, and that's a game changer for England, as we're going to find out. What about Washington's army, the one that had gotten beat up trying to keep the British out of Philadelphia and were unsuccessful? Well, they took their army, which was, again, a real fighting force, even though they were quite modest, probably under 15,000 soldiers. And they built an encampment outside of Philadelphia in an area that had been known for iron forges in Pennsylvania. And this area was called Valley Forge because it was supposed to be a land of plenty. We know from our earlier discussions that Pennsylvania was kind of known as the one of the bread basket colonies. And so it would feed the army, and the army suffered through the Valley Forge encampment. You can see this is a recreation of the cabins at the Valley Forge encampment in 1777 and 1778. The army did suffer because of the winter not being particularly bad, but just the logistics of keeping the army fed and paid. Washington tried to ensure the health of the army by mandating, this is a reenactor, this is not a real person suffering from smallpox, but it gives you an idea what smallpox would do to you. The idea of using a sick person to give a healthy person smallpox virus had been around for over 100 years. Some folks in New England, taught by actually an African who knew this procedure, was a way to find these sores on these sick folks and then inject this stuff that was growing on people into the healthy person, and hopefully you live through it. So this all gets back to Washington's army because he insists and mandates that the Continental Army get inoculated for smallpox. So it gives you a weak version of this particular ailment, and then hopefully you were well enough to fight it off. So that helped with the Continental Army. There was a lot of death through exposure, starvation, malnutrition. But the one thing the Army did get was better training. They had a lot of foreigners come over. One of the most important being, of course, who was just absolutely enamored by the American cause, was the Marquis de Lafayette, who Washington kind of took on as an adopted son. Lafayette is 18 or 19 years old. He's told by his family and the King of France, don't go over there. You're not authorized to go over there, and he does it anyway. So to his credit, Washington gives him command of soldiers in some of the campaigns, does okay in that capacity. But one of the other grifters, I guess you could call him, someone who's not particularly real with their so-called impressive credentials, is this gentleman who's training a small squad of soldiers here. This is Baron von Steuben. He says he is a Prussian drill master, and he wasn't. Probably involved in scandal back in Europe, but comes over and trains a small group of the Continental Army at a time. In the Manual of Arms, you can see that these gentlemen are at various stages of loading their muskets and putting together the two-rank method by which you will fire these muskets. And that's all done to instill some discipline in the Continental Army. And so the Valley Forge encampment is really tough, but those who survive it kind of take it like kind of a badge of honor. We survived this. It was awful, and we'll come out on the other end stronger. The makeup of the Continental Army was also changing. Um, we don't have the same group of individuals who rallied to the Army when we're talking about Lexington and Concord and the siege of Boston. The Army's makeup is changing. It is made up more and more of former indentures who don't have a lot of cash or land um, to their credit. The Continental Army is basically paid, when it is paid, a pittance, but it is paid. And sometimes it's given what are known as promissory notes, which are basically IOUs, because halfway through the war, the Congress is broke, prints money. But as we know, when you print money, it's not worth as much as it used to be. So you get staggering inflation in the United States in 1778 and beyond. So these folks who didn't have any ability or any chance in their life to get land, and the Congress was also promising when they didn't have money or the money was worthless, they handed out land bounties. Sign up for a year in the Army, and you will get an area of land if you survive and if the revolution is in fact successful. So that's why you get indentures, landless sons, and you also get a significant part of the Army that was African American. We think about a fifth of the Continental Army was black. These would have been, again, free people in the North, free people of color in the North, runaway slaves, anyone else who might have gone in place of their owner to fill a recruitment that the Congress asked of the different states. At first, Washington is hesitant. I don't know if I want to have an army with slaves and former slaves and free people of color in the army, but he changes his mind. Congress says, look, you make up your mind. You decide. Washington is a slave owner. Washington, again, gets to the point, I think, that if he can recruit anyone who's willing to fight for the Continental Army and for the cause, that would be great. So some slaves fight for their freedom and get it as a result of serving in the Continental Army, and they get land grants and they do get paid, and they are in an army that is integrated, which is not really what we follow throughout most of our history. Most of the American armies in conflicts are segregated. Certainly they were after the American Revolution and not desegregated until the Korean War in 1950. Civil War units in the North, whole black regiments were recruited. They served separately from white units, and that continued through the end of, unfortunately, the Second World War, where the Army continued to be segregated. So it means that the character of the war is changing, the expectations of what could take place and change after the American Revolution. So Baron von Steuben's training, the smallpox inoculation, the epidemic that goes through. There's a smallpox epidemic. It hits, for example, the Caddo Indians in Louisiana in now Spanish-controlled territory. Hits them really hard, and it travels from New England all the way down to the Gulf South. So making sure that the Army can fight, come out of the winter of 1778 successfully is a big deal. So when the French join and become an ally of the United States, it changes the strategy for the English. And we'll go back to the PowerPoint here. When the British are trying to put down a colonial rebellion, they're just trying to do that. There's no sense that this could be possibly a world war conflict, because the American Navy and the American Army cannot threaten Great Britain and threaten their other colonies. But when France joins, in the first year they will join in 1778, is um, a priority for the English to have to protect their other colonies. And one area is in the British West Indies. And so they keep that in mind. So no longer are they just, all right, let's put down the rebellion, capture the rebel leaders, try them for treason, swing them from a rope, whatever. All of that has to take place. But also with France entering the conflict, they have to be more mindful of protecting these West Indies. Some of these are still Spanish islands, for example, Cuba, but some of the smaller British West Indies here on the Leeward Islands and the Lesser Antilles could be captured by the French. So, there's some reluctance among the folks in the United States saying, and members of Congress, if France joins, they'll fight for their own reasons. They won't really help us. but there's a mentality that, look, we have to accept their help. We have to try to get this alliance. It can really, really turn the tide, which of course it does. So this becomes a larger conflict for England. So this is what they want to prioritize. Number one, protect the British West Indies. And the other thing they want to do is reopen a campaign in the South. The British had been unsuccessful in capturing Charlestown in 1776. An American army and militia and a really interesting group of soldiers, including some Indians in the Catawba Nation, actually left South Carolina and aided the American effort. One of the few Indian groups that sided with the rebels, if you want to call them, or the United States. Yeah. And they were very helpful at trying to repel the English invasion of Charleston, which was successful in 1776. Okay, so that didn't work out very well. So the British are trying to open up a new Southern strategy. A couple of reasons for this are, as already mentioned, the concentration on making sure that their West Indies and the Carolinas and Georgia are closer to the West Indies than Philadelphia and New York. So what takes place is that the British also want to start this with an invasion of both Savannah in 1779 and aim at Charleston. So they want to maintain and operate a safe port or haven along the coast at different locations. They also think, do the British, that in the American South, particularly in the Carolinas, they'll be able to utilize a lot of Americans who are not supporting the revolution. In other words, the Loyalists or Tories. They're wrong about that. I don't think the concentration of Tories is any stronger in Carolinas than anywhere else. There are pockets of strength among loyalism, certainly in eastern North Carolina, New York City, other locations, maybe even some folks in the city of Charleston. They're really the only southern city in the American colonies and now the United States. And the strategy seems to go very, very well. The British capture Savannah, they capture Charleston in 1780, and a whole American army had surrendered. This is a really devastating defeat as far as they're concerned. But then the British go and they try to fan out into the Carolina countryside. We'll pull up this slide again. As you can see the capture here, the efforts to try to march into areas of upstate South Carolina and into North Carolina are led by the gentleman on the right. This is General Charles Cornwallis, Lord Cornwallis, because he's given that official title. He's one of the most able commanders for the British. But after the surrender of Charleston, what he finds out is that it's really difficult to try to, end the resistance in the Carolinas, because when you do that, you sometimes have to employ these really harsh tactics. You've got to commandeer people's private property. You might even, for Southerners, threaten to free their slaves. You might take their horses because your cavalry needs them. You might take their feed. Anything is fair game for the British war effort. And so by trying to end the rebellion, you push a lot of people who are sitting on the sidelines. You know, there's a portion of the population which supports the rebellion. There's a portion that supports Great Britain. And there's just as significant a group of Americans who just don't want anything to do with it. And so for them up to this point, the war hadn't touched their lives until Cornwallis starts marching inward. And he deploys his cavalry commanders to go out there and try to hunt down the small bands of leaders who still exist. Even though Charleston had been lost, there were people like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, he's nicknamed, Andrew Pickens, and others who were out there. And the rebellion in the Carolinas never really ends. Washington also recognizes that, look, we're going to have to get somebody down there because he, Washington at this point, is keeping one eye on the British who are still occupying New York. And he's also trying to coordinate with the French. And that's not going too well. The French are becoming frustrated. It's now 1780 and 1781. The nation is absolutely flat broke. Washington has had to put down a mutiny of one whole group of soldiers who, during one of the encampments, say, "That's it, we're done. Our enlistments should be up if they're not up already, and we want to go home." And that's a difficult situation to be in. You have to keep the army around, but you're not, at least at this point of the conflict, fighting any major battles. So Washington says, "All right, we lost the whole army at Charleston. What I'm going to need to do is put someone very competent in charge." And he chooses the gentleman on the left. This is Nathaniel Greene. And when Cornwallis marches inward into Carolina, he's heading now towards what's Columbia, the central part of the state, the modern capital of South Carolina. Cornwallis finds that there are not a bunch of loyalists who, throw roses at the feet of the soldiers as they walk through the streets of these different towns and villages. Instead, he walks into what's called a hornet's nest. And the revolution never goes away in the Carolinas. What Greene does is organizes all the scattered forces and says, "Look, all you guys who are fighting, who attacked the wagon trains and kind of snipe at the British everywhere, that's fine and dandy. But Washington has sent me down here with some forces, some of the most reliable troops we have, and we're going to organize an actual campaign here." And Greene does that. And to go back to the map for a minute, you can see what Greene does. He basically drags Cornwallis into the interior of the Carolinas. He dares Cornwallis to chase him. And they lose most of the battles that they fight. They surprise a small group of British here in northwestern South Carolina. It's a beautiful area, having traveled to it a lot, at a place called the Cow Pens, because that's where cattle drovers brought their cattle before they took them to market. That becomes a scene of a very important battle because it brings a lot of people from the foothills of the Carolinas into the fighting. And it reminds the soldiers that Greene needs, the militia, come out here and serve for 90 days, for 6 months or whatever. We can turn the tide. We'll use the small force of the Continental Army, the long-term soldiers, and we'll also use our militia. So this is basically, as you see the map, as Cornwallis basically chases Greene across the Carolinas and into Virginia. And it's a cat and mouse game, which Greene is more successful. And when Cornwallis is getting further away from the coast, his army is getting weaker, Greene's army is getting stronger, until he actually turns. And near Greensboro, North Carolina, in the spring of 1781, he attacks Cornwallis's army. And though Greene loses the battle, it's one of those things where it was very difficult for Cornwallis to continue. So you can see this line on the map where he just kind of hightails it all the way across to Wilmington by the spring of 1781. And with Cornwallis now kind of there on the coast, it is Greene who says, "All right, now we're going to repel and clear out all of the other British fighting units in the Carolinas." And so he does that. And his mantra is, just like Washington tells him, "Look, whatever you do, don't let the army get destroyed." And so Greene loses a lot of the battles, but at the end of the battle, he's able to take the Southern army out and use it again to fight. So his mantra is, we fight the British on my terms. We get beat, because we lose most of the battles. We are able to rise up, lick our wounds, keep the rebellion and the resistance alive, recruit more militia, and then we fight again. And the whole time this is happening, the British army is getting more and more weak. So by the end of 1781, it's Cornwallis who says, "Oh yeah, the Carolinas are pacified. Everything's great, just fantastic." And the opposite was true. He leaves the Carolinas to make his way towards Virginia. And while this is happening, Greene just, fights other smaller British forces scattered around North and South Carolina. Meanwhile, Washington, kind of sitting on the sidelines with all of this taking place, is desperate for a chance to combine his army with the French army. And the French are very gracious. They basically tell Washington, "Look, the French general, my army is at your disposal. So you can do what you would like with it." They have a very impressive parade. Most of the Continental Army soldiers don't have shoes. It looks kind of really bad. Washington kind of is like, this is embarrassing. But the army is still around and strong enough to go on the offensive if only they could get an opportunity. And that opportunity finally comes at the end of 1780 and the beginning of 1781. And it's just in time. I think 1780 is really I think many consider it, and I agree, a low point for the American fortunes. It's been made clear to Washington and really to the Congress that the French are really not going to be in it any longer until 1781. They're going to remove their navy, their army out of American land and American waters. That's not good. And so Washington, just hopes there is an opportunity to strike as a combined effort with the French. So we'll go back to the map and see that location that he thinks would be just perfect for it. When Cornwallis abandons the Carolinas, he makes his way into Virginia, and that's where the turncoat Benedict Arnold is now wearing the British scarlet uniforms since he sold out the American cause, or at least attempted to. And what Cornwallis is trying to do is bring about some kind of conflict into Virginia. He almost captures Governor Thomas Jefferson in 1781. Jefferson kind of runs with the British cavalry hot on his heels. It's kind of the low point for Thomas Jefferson's political career. He had gotten elected governor of Virginia, and he made one of many promises that he'd never run for office ever again. Of course, he does. This is particularly humiliating for him. And then, of course, desperate, Washington sends Lafayette down to Virginia, and Cornwallis makes all these, bragging remarks. I'll catch the boy. He can't escape me, referring to Lafayette. Lafayette does. He proves to be fairly crafty in frustrating Cornwallis's efforts in Virginia until finally it's Cornwallis who says, all right, we're going to find yet another safe haven, safe harbor. And he makes his way to a small tobacco port on the York River known as Yorktown. And he kind of slowed down his offensive operations. He can't go out and try to knock out the American forces in Virginia. And Washington is like, oh my gosh, it's our golden opportunity. You can see what Washington plans. He wants to leave a small force in New York and just take the army by land and sea, along with the Rochambeau as a reference to the French general. So the combined Allied armies make their way south, marching part of the way, hopefully with the British not noticing that it's happening, and then along the Delaware River and the Chesapeake Bay until they get to Virginia itself, and they surround Cornwallis. And the really important part of this campaign, known as the Yorktown Campaign, is when the French Navy defeats a British force at the Battle of the Virginia Capes. And so what that does, this naval battle, and you're thinking, how is this related to Washington's plans? And with the British Navy scattered, it means that Cornwallis is trapped. And there's a story going around at the time that when Washington hears about the French victory off the Virginia coastline, he grabs Rochambeau, the French general, and kisses both of his cheeks on his face. And basically, just the signal to him that, aha, we might be able to spring this trap and make it a reality. And it is a reality. Surrounded with his back to the water throughout the fall of 1781, Cornwallis is forced to live in a cave because the French and American artillery begin to send shells into the British lines at Yorktown. It's an unfortunate campaign for the English because now that the Navy is gone, they have no way to evacuate themselves. So that French naval victory was really, really significant. And facing destruction of his army, Cornwallis asks for surrender. You can see here that the British second in command is giving the surrender to the American second in command. Washington is sitting there in the background, the famous Trumbull painting of the surrender at Yorktown. October 1781, often seen as a significant end to the fighting in the American Revolution. The British band plays a popular tune called The World Turned Upside Down. The British furl their flags and all their insignia flags for their different units. And people in Parliament are rumored to have been saying, it's over, it's all over, but it may or may not be. Uh, that's the unknown in the fall of 1781. The other British presence in North America remains, of course, in New York. So this begs the question, is the surrender of the British at Yorktown the end? The king, will he try to recruit another army? Will Parliament support it? But it turns out that the real factor in ending the American Revolution, yes, Yorktown is important, but the British could have continued. They would have been difficult. It would have been logistically challenged, but they could have reinforced the army at New York. And by the way, Washington, after the Battle of Yorktown, very successful, rushes his army back outside New York to keep an eye out on the only fighting force, the British, significant one that they have in North America there in New York City. So the British public tires of the war. The British voters, the men who can vote to have members of parliament who promise to end the war. So we have a peace party, not a party to celebrate the peace, but meaning people run on a platform in parliament as candidates to say, let's end this war. It had been going on essentially for 6 long years. It would take a couple more for it to actually end. And in that time, Washington has to do something very difficult, and all the other officers keep an army in the field because the British are still occupying New York, and there's nobody to fight because everyone is now recognizing that the American negotiators and the English negotiators are going to try to bring about a formal end to the war. Washington puts down a mutiny of his soldiers. His officers are like, we're going to march on, Congress, wherever the hell Congress is, because Congress was running around basically like a rock band on tour from the evacuation of Philadelphia going on and on. So Washington, again, personally intervenes and says that, look, I've sacrificed a lot. So have you. I've gone nearly blind and gray in the service of my country. He understands that it's very difficult to continue to train an army, right? And drill them and do the marching and sit in cold encampments, just waiting for any formal news that the war is over. So the X factor in bringing about the end of the war is the British public. They have grown tired of it. They don't see a way of it being successful. And a lot of that goes into fast tracking a process where negotiation takes a long, long time. But it does happen. In 1783, there is news from Paris, France, where 20 years before, in 1763, it had been England's finest hour, right? They had vanquished France and Spain together. France is gone from the North American continent, and it had been an era of Pax Britannica, British peace. 20 years later, England loses its colonies in North America. The Treaty of Paris in 1783. In it, Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The United States now extends to the Mississippi River. The territories of Florida, both the Panhandle and the Peninsula, were given back to Spain. Spain had played a role. They had helped Americans keep the British out of the Gulf South in campaigns in 1780. And the British decided it wasn't worth holding on to Florida because it had been cleared out of Spanish people, because they didn't want to, again, pledge their allegiance to the King, George III. So many of them scattered to Louisiana, French Louisiana, now Spanish Louisiana. Others went to Cuba, others went back to Europe. So Florida was turned back over to the nation of Spain. The British, of course, had to get some promises from the United States. They said that the loyalists, the people who remained, Americans who supported the English cause and were against independence and the revolution, be treated fairly, their property be given back. If it was confiscated, that would have to go through some legal processes, and the United States agreed to that. Washington returned to Congress at the end of 1783. The Continental Army, the soldiers that did the fighting, basically disbanded. The British evacuated New York. Washington, again, 7 years after, they had to abandon New York and leave it to the British in that disastrous campaign, marched the Continental Army through it, and then told them, well, good luck to all of you, said goodbye to his officers. And here in this very dramatic painting, he surrenders his commission. That's what he's holding in his hand. It's the piece of paper that he was given basically, what would that be, 8 years before, uh, announcing that he would be commander of the Continental Army. He says, look, I've done what I set out to do. And now, in his words, he said, I retire from the great theater of action. And George III couldn't believe it. He said, when he was told Washington is quitting the army, he's going back to his farm. George III says he'll be the greatest man ever if this is true. And it was, we just take it for granted today. The war's over, he gives back his commission. But think about a lot of other revolutions through history that didn't end the same way. The French Revolution, we get the guillotine, the reign of terror, and then we get Napoleon. The Chinese Revolution, where tens of millions were killed. And this one turned out a little bit differently. Was it revolutionary? Maybe not. It put a lot of the same people in power. In fact, the American were put in power. A lot of them had positions of prominence when we were still parts of Great Britain. So Washington goes back to his farm. It's literally Christmas Eve, 1783. And it begins a really challenging stage for the United States. We're looking at a map now of the U.S. as a result of the Treaty of Paris. You can see that we are no longer hemmed in along the Appalachian Mountains in the so-called Royal Proclamation of 1763, sorry. And so the nation now extends to the Mississippi River. Florida, you can see, is returned to Spain, both the peninsula all the way up to the Mississippi River and Baton Rouge, and the part of the peninsula. So both sections there. There's area that's disputed between the United States and Spain. Our new neighbor to the west across the Mississippi is Spain. France is still gone from North America. The red blocks scattered along the Great Lakes, some of which are on American soil, are forts where the British maintain forts, even after the end of the war. We're going to talk a little bit about that on the next lecture in the 1780s. The British leverage one aspect of the Treaty of Paris. Hey, United States, you owed us, a lot of your citizens, a lot of money. Remember the balance, the trade imbalance that we had compared to the British when we were buying all those things that everybody liked and buying it on credit, and credit terms were very generous. Well, just because we were independent and we won our little revolution, the English said, doesn't mean you still don't have to pay off those debts. And until those debts are paid, we're going to keep these soldiers in the forts around this area in the red blocks right there on American soil. So it represents one of many challenges for the United States, and that's having the rest of the world take us seriously. The period from 1783 to 1787, it's often called the critical period, like with a question mark. Is it the critical period? Not sure. Some say it isn't. Others say the nation which had won its independence was on the verge of failure. So it's some of the most difficult years in American history. We have neighbors who don't want us to expand to the west, the Spanish, the British in the north, and Canada. They will try to contain the United States. We'll have a host of challenges. What will the revolution mean for, again, the future of slavery, for the future of settling land in the West? What about Native American nations, most of which sided with the British for good reason? The British were going to keep the American colonists on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, with Great Britain gone, what would happen to them? The indigenous people of the United States were generally and rightfully concerned about what was going to happen in the decades after 1783, because most Americans thought all the Indians sided with the British lost, now we get to do what we want. And one of the things we had wanted to do before the British shut down the West was move to the West. But that was fraught with danger and challenges. So this is the next chapter as we go forward after 1783. And all of this gets tied to what a lot of folks think is the real problem in the nation. The government is not up to, the government of the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, written during the Revolution, is not up to the challenges that the nation faces beyond 1783. So there is already murmurings of maybe giving more powers to that government. There are just as many people who say, no, leave it alone. We don't want to replace English tyranny of the 1760s and 70s with American homegrown tyranny. We can't do it. Power in the 1780s exists in the states, not in the national government. Some folks in Congress, in the states, military veterans who are officers and enlisted men, put together a group who think maybe we should, invest the national government with some more power. The revolution was won not because of the Congress and the Articles of Confederation, but in spite of it. And so that will take us to the decade of the 1780s and the nationalist movement, the movement within the nation by a few, but a vocal, articulate, educated few, some who had real-time experience, to try to give the national government some more powers. It was a very uphill battle, and it would lead eventually to a meeting in Philadelphia in 1787 to fix the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation.